G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far that you are having a fantastic week. Now slowly but surely in the war of attrition I'm in with my chemotherapy, I am deteriorating a little bit as this fourth round drags on. But tomorrow we finish the round and we get some fluids and some drugs. The weekend is going to be rough, but again, we will get through it. And on Monday, I celebrate my birthday, so hopefully I am well enough. Now, legends, of course, as always, we have a lot to go over. We need to, of course, to look at the maps, geolocations, compare maps, and of course talk about the offensive that Ukraine has now gone on in several directions. Now, is this some game-changing, whole massive thing like all the YouTubers who haven't shown maps for 15 months are now showing? Well, we'll go over it and why this lines up with Ukraine's optics-based command, why this makes sense at this point in time, but also how all of this is then a double-edged sword to do with strategy. So we'll talk about that. We'll show you where things have moved. Of course, we need to talk about US intelligence being cut off. Not only US intelligence, but that intelligence, if that is then shared to the UK or France or Germany, that then can't be transferred to Ukraine. Now, so many people are downplaying this, and I've said this now for days, and I've got videos where I show how dramatic the US overmatch in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance is compared to Europe, of how much of a catastrophe that would be, and that has been cut off, and this is just forcing Zelensky into a corner to negotiate. Of course, on that, we also need to talk about what Macron has said about the future of relations with the US, about Europe, about Ukraine, and the divide that we see there. And I want to go a step further and look just not surface. You can think tactics, surface level, strategic is then everything below that, and how then there is this strategic plan that is working, that the European Union and then NATO is being divided, and how people such as Xi Jinping or Putin can influence that further. The crack has started and then they can turn that into a crevasse. And what I will say before we get into the very start of the video is the danger to NATO and Europe. It's not Trump, it's not Xi, it's not Putin, it's not Modi, it's not information. The danger is internal. Not upholding your core values of democracy. You claim to practice democracy, but again and again what we see is authoritarianism being fought with authoritarianism. Now, people will look at the reduction in dominance of Europe and they will blame X or Y or Z, whether it is the US or Sino or Russia. And what I'll say is, no, it's just very hard to look internally at what is going on here. And I think this is the perfect example before we get then into the intelligence. And I've seen all the usual Twitter and Telegrams sharing this. And this gentleman here, this Tristan Snell, who's a lawyer, commentator, and, quote, a fighter for democracy. Okay, what he has shared, and many others have shared, this is breaking. Hungary to be stripped of voting rights in European Parliament for engaging in pro-Putin and anti-Ukraine obstructionism. Saying, excellent news, now kick them out of the EU entirely. And you wonder why the US and Europe and other countries and other nations are growing apart. Now, what I'll say is, well, no, it's not breaking of this. It's, as far as my reading, that the Volt Party, who is relatively small, will send a 9-point plan to European Union leaders, including a call to strip Hungary of its voting rights. The Volt Party is a progressive, pan-European political movement that originated in Hungary but has expanded across Europe. But people like Mr. Snell here, and many others I see sharing this, these are the same ones who preach democracy and are complete hypocrites, and they are imperialists. They are specifically woke imperialists. Only democratic when it suits them. They want total democracy, we'll go over that, to fight authoritarianism with their own authoritarianism that they will then justify. And this goes into my theory, or what I've put as Willie's theory of utopia, that anyone who sees that there is a utopia will justify extreme measures to get there. But let's continue on what I'm seeing, and this is a real danger to Europe and the West as a whole, is this idea of fighting authoritarianism with authoritarianism, like we have seen, trying to fight Russia through Hungary by your own authoritarianism, although you claim to preach for the fight of democracy. Therefore, you will restrict freedom of speech, you'll ban opposition parties and impose strict measures, and then you will have greater oppression. But you will justify this through your own means of what you see as utopia. Let's continue where I think Europe is not only on a bit of a slide, I think they're on a slippery dip all the way down at bloody terminal velocity into this currently. This is what I call total democracy. It means you're free to feel and choose how you think and act. But if your actions and feelings don't align with the state's values, you become an enemy of the state. For example, you can have your opinions on the Ukraine war, migration, or gender, but if they don't match the state's views, then you are considered an enemy. And if Hungary or Slovakia or whatever nation does not fit, then the approved opinions of the EU, they are then seen as an enemy. And this is the biggest threat, I believe, facing the West. And it is currently being done mostly by what I call left woke imperialists. But of course, we have seen this historically done as well with plenty of right-wing examples of this. And when I say woke imperialism, what am I talking about? And I just wrote up this with the help of some AI because my spelling and grammar sucks. I'm a soldier, not an academic. That while traditional imperialism was defined by territorial conquest and economic domination, today's version is cultural and ideological, under the banner of progressive values. Talk about this as the European Union. Member states that resist progressive social policies often face diplomatic, economic, or even legal repercussions. Countries like Hungary and Poland, which have rejected aspects of this ideological agenda, are frequently accused of being authoritarian or undemocratic, despite their governments being democratically elected. The hypocrisy of woke imperialism is striking. While Western nations claim to oppose the imperialist practices of the past, they now engage in softer, more insidious form of control. Instead of military force, they leverage institutions, trade agreements, and media influence to reshape societies according to their own ideological preferences. And things like this, the reason I bring this up is I think this is something we need to talk about when we talk about Europe and we see the divide, is it's things like this exactly driving that divide, that no, democracy is only good when it suits my views. We would have seen this, of course, in a lot of political parties. If they had won, we would have seen this in Germany. We are seeing this in Romania. We're seeing it in Hungary. We've seen it in Poland. We've seen it in Slovakia. And we're even seeing it in the United States, that no, we want to uphold democracy. The party you don't want to win wins. And then no, it's undemocratic. We need to be authoritarian and to put in the person I want. And this is a very, very dangerous slope that I believe we're on. And who capitalizes on this? Well, the other players around the world are pushing and capitalizing on this. And what the US is doing is then, of course, removing and distancing themselves from this. Now, we'll talk more about Europe and Macron and maybe Putin or Xi's strategies later on. Let's then talk about US intelligence being cut. Now, so many people, I've said this for now weeks, are focused on hard assets. No, focus on soft assets. That's where the US excels. The Trump administration pauses intelligence sharing with Ukraine. The Trump administration, they have paused this alongside their military aid, of course, those hard assets. A US official said that military targeting information was no longer being shared with Ukraine. A senior Ukrainian official said that the pause would make it more difficult to strike Russian forces, but that Kyiv's military had access to other satellite imagery. And one of the byproducts of this will be things like this. Of overnight, we've seen that Russia continues to strike Ukraine with missiles and drones. This image here is in Odessa of a Goran 2 strike. I think we will see a sharp increase in strikes, although the numbers reported will not reflect this, but we may get footage. It seems like we're getting a lot more footage of this. What I'll say, no other country, as far as on whole, China in some aspects is ahead, say in some areas of human intelligence, but behind in others, some areas such as signals intelligence and satellites too. So there's, as far as who's ahead as a whole, it is at this point at least open source, unclassified. It does look like the US. But no other country can match the overall ISR capabilities of the US. These capabilities cannot be replaced by current European intelligence, signals intelligence, satellites, live tracking, all of that. It cannot be. Can Europe simply relay US intelligence? Well, working with anything classified, even at the lowest level, it's not that easy. It's all very traceable. It's not as easy as you think. It's not forwarding emails around. And even if they wanted to do this, US satellites, well, if they're not just simply taking the images, there might not be anything to actually then forward on. And of course, there's a lot of other potential restrictions and relationships at threat doing this if you're not allowed to. But last night, United Kingdom military intelligence expert Phil Ingram told the Daily Mail the United States' instruction to stop allies sharing US-derived intelligence with Ukraine is what I would expect. The US intelligence partners, including Britain, have had their authority to pass on intelligence revoked. So he has seen, and most others I'm seeing report around this, from Wall Street Journal to Politico to many others, are saying that no, at this point in time, those states, France, Germany, UK, they have not got permission to pass that on to Ukraine. CIA Director John Ratcliffe and the National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, they both confirmed a pause in intelligence support, but suggested it could be short-lived if Ukraine quickly came back to the negotiating table. Mr. Ratcliffe saying President Zelensky put out a statement that said, "I'm ready for peace, and I want President Donald Trump's leadership to bring about that peace." And so I think on the military front and the intelligence front, the pause that allowed that to happen, I think will go away, and I think we'll work shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. Mr. Waltz has told reporters at the White House that the US has taken a step back and was pausing and reviewing all aspects of this relationship. In addition to the targeting information, the pause also affected some intelligence about advanced warning of drone and missile strikes. So again, trying to leverage in here what they can to draw Ukraine into negotiations. Now, again, I'm not going to go over this. I shared this the other day along with several other slides about what Europe can replace, what Europe can't replace as far as realistically real-time missile warning and space-based ISR, as well as Starlink, where there are some replacements, but it's not as good in all of this, but how this would severely disrupt Ukraine's battlefield communications, their overview, all of this. You can go through this yourself. You can pause it here if you would like, that the EU, Europe can fill some gaps, but not to the extent, of course, that America has for up until this point in the war. And we'll talk about this because, of course, we've seen a Ukrainian offensive today. Now, continuing on this, everything that came from the Defense Department has stopped. This is from the former head of the GUR, Ukraine's military intelligence. This mostly concerns the exchange of imagery. This isn't critical because European companies have their own satellites, but not all these are focused on military dislocation and movements, which is important, and real-time updates as well. The CIA, they also have a sizable presence in Ukraine, where it has been working alongside Ukrainians to help with targeting. Again, at one point this was conspiracy, and now it is common knowledge. Some of its officers have been deployed to Ukrainian bases where they review lists of potential Russian targets that the Ukrainians are preparing to strike, comparing the information that the Ukrainians have with US intelligence to ensure that it is accurate. And I'm sure they have a lot more jobs to do there than just that. The CIA has also helped Ukrainians build at least 3 secret signals intelligence collection bases, which the Ukrainians use to intercept Russian communications, reducing their dependence on the US for intelligence somewhat, but all these bases will be using US equipment. The satellites or anything relaying here is still going to be US based. Trump administration officials have said the pauses were a warning to the Ukrainians of the consequences if they did not cooperate with Mr. Trump's peace plan. So putting the pressure on, leveraging, trying to bring Zelensky across. But we'll see if Europe has the appetite for that. But European countries are trying to develop their own plan that could win over both Mr. Trump and Mr. Zelensky. And there has been rumours that the French, the German, and the UK are going to be heading to Washington to speak to Trump to present their plan. Again, we will see. In a statement on Wednesday, US European Command said it had received an order to pause security assistance to the Ukrainian military. A spokesman for the command said delivery of military equipment that had been promised as part of the presidential drawdown authority had been suspended, it had been paused, and even material in transit was halted, and even material in Ukraine's moved into secure facilities. There was a lot of reporting that even planes in the air were getting turned back around. Now, I do wonder how much money the CIA and intelligence has had for Ukraine. Could this be the mysterious amount of well over $100 billion that we need to reach Trump's claimed $350 billion in spending? I don't know. I've told you before how with accounting you could make any figure you want. You could make it seem like $10 as well, depending on the replacement value cost of equipment. But again, could we see that CIA and Intel costs raises massively in this? Now, the biggest issues I see from this is Russian missile early warning and interception. And that's why I think we'll see significantly more strikes. Psychological impact on the soldiers at the front line fighting that the US, their greatest partner, is pulling out. US relationship with Europe, that deteriorating rapidly, and Russia's nuclear threat grows due to reduced early warning and tracking, that those threats coming in the future that may come are going to be more of a threat than they were before. And there is going to be potentially more missiles wasted. Storm Shadows, ATACMS, it doesn't matter if it is then American or not, these all rely on American systems and targeting. All we know already is that some of these are already claimed to be wasted. We've seen a lot of criticism about that. But without intelligence, well, many more may be completely wasted against older targets or targets that have superior air defense where they will not break through. So this is a huge thing. People are downplaying it. Okay, people will move it around. But the US intelligence in here, we will never know how much was actually given. But we know it was massive, and we know no other country, at least involved in this war on that front, can compete. Now, there's been this come out from the Kremlin spokesman, of course, Dmitry Peskov, and Lukashenko, the leader of Belarus. Now, the Belarusian leader has said, if you want, come here. This was speaking about then peace negotiations in Belarus. It's only 200 kilometres from the Belarusian border to Kyiv, half an hour by plane. You're welcome to come. We can sit down. We'll come to an agreement quietly, without noise, without shouting. So tell Trump I'm waiting for him here, alongside Putin and Zelensky. We'll sit down and calmly negotiate if you want to make a deal. Now, Peskov has said the issue has not been brought up or discussed in any way, but of course, Minsk is the best place for us. It is our main ally, so it is the best place for negotiations. According to Peskov, the Kremlin is positive about Zelensky's stated readiness to come to the negotiating table. Now, in this, he also says the question is with whom will be sitting at the negotiating table. So far, there is a legal prohibition for the Ukrainian president to negotiate with the Russian side. Therefore, in general, the approach is positive, but the nuances have not yet changed. And what I have said is this will be the biggest indicator of when Ukraine is going to negotiate, because it has to go from Zelensky through the radar of lifting the law that makes it illegal to negotiate with Russia at this point in time. And until that is lifted, well, there's no signs of real negotiations happening. Now, what do I think of Belarus as the place for negotiations? Well, I think Peskov answers it in here. It is our main ally, so it's the best for us for negotiations. Well, that's not where a mediator should be sitting. I think the best location, I think the most likely, is probably Saudi Arabia due to prior mediations. And it's also, Saudi has huge influence with OPEC, of course, with their oil. So I think that is where we will see that. So let's look at the maps and see where things are shifting around. Of course, we have Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv, red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, of course, any blue is going to be advances over the past 2 weeks. Any red check is going to be Russian advances over the past 24 hours. Now, we'll come down in here. Now, realistically, there is very, very little changes on this map. It's hard to know exactly what is going on. The fog of war is massive, but we'll show you some comparisons and some geolocations too. But of course, everyone has known, and it's been the title of everyone, that Ukraine has had a, quote, major game-changing offensive. Now, firstly, I'll say, no, it's just these people haven't looked at a map for 15 months and are zooming on a 24-hour period, not on a 15-month period. But I fear that these attacks, they fall in line with the optics-based command decisions. Now, this optics-based command decisions makes some sense as Ukraine's centre of gravity, their industrial capacity and economic support is outside of Ukraine and it is in the West. But therefore, decisions have to be weighted with a how does it look? For example, withdrawing from Bakhmut was definitely the most strategically sound decision. But when you overlay this with then a how does it look, well then you hold at all costs. We've seen this exactly in Kursk and Avdiivka as well. But of course, this optics-based command decisions is a double-edged sword because the costs always catch up. These recent local attacks, and no, this is not earth-shattering like the YouTubers announcing it who haven't looked at the maps for 12 months or longer, are saying, and the reason these attacks occurred today is to show the West that Ukraine is still capable of offensive assaults. Again, optics over strategy, or optics driving command decisions. Of course, you need some of that, but at the same time, it can't just all be that. Ukraine, in its current position, should only be doing minor assaults to improve desperate situations while slowly pulling back to address manpower issues and command issues, especially while US aid and intelligence have been paused. If that aid and intelligence has been paused, the last thing you should do strategically is then go on the assault with the manpower and command issues. Optically, though, maybe go on the assault to try and show, hey, look, we can advance and do this. There's a reason this then occurred over the past few days. But much like Bakhmut, Avdiivka and Kursk, early successes will likely turn into long-term issues. You always pay your debt. Russian military leaders, they do have to consider optics, but due to their centre of gravity being in Moscow, so domestic centre of gravity, they don't have to consider it as much. Kursk is the best example of this. There is no doubt that Russia could remove troops from Donbass and collapse Kursk. But if you ignore then how it looks, Kursk is helping Russia with their objectives in the east by tying up a lot of Ukrainian assets. As I said in the very early days of Kursk, that the best move here for the Russians is to stabilise, ignore and push down in the east. And the best for Ukraine would be a quick raid. You get the optics, you get all the positive then media, you get the POWs, but you're not left holding disadvantageous terrain. So far, I believe that I'm correct. So there is a reason we have seen these occur over the past few days, but what I say is, well, it does not seem like the best time to do this at all, and I think we could see, much like Kursk or Avdiivka or Bakhmut, that the attempt to have optics then have a large backfire. And we get an idea of how this is now going to look moving forwards. The Ukrainians are losing the war so badly. No, sir. Actually, they're holding off the Russians and even recapturing some areas. Here is a map. Fine then. Let's take away their weapons and stop sharing intelligence. But, sir, then they'll lose the war. Well, I told you so. And this gives us a great insight in how the narrative will shift to where we would have won if the US then continued support, while ignoring the entirety of 2024 and the beginning of 2025. Nothing will be spoken about of the Russian advances with US aid and intelligence intervention throughout 24 and 25. That the situation continued to deteriorate even with that due to mobilization and command issues and overall overmatch on the battlefield. That the situation then deteriorated past an event horizon. But we take just a snippet of the past 24 hours because people love to look at this as linear warfare to suit then a narrative and say, no, it was then the US, when even with all of the US support under the Democratic Party, that things were still moving backwards and increasing in speed in that movements as well. But we get a glimpse of how this is going to then be sold to many, many people. Of course, increasing the hate on the US and shifting the blame there. So let's have a look then at some areas of which have shifted. Now, let's talk about Toretsk. Now, this is the area that is most unclear at this point in time. There are some geolocations around where my cursor is at this point, but as far as maps showing exactly what is happening here, it's very, very unclear. Let's talk about it at Suryak's map. Now, showing this movement into here, but this is still only where the deep state ever showed grey zone. Situation of Russian army inside the city continues to deteriorate. Ukrainian army recaptured this area and infiltrated new areas of Zabalka district. As a result of this infiltration, Russian forces began retreating from the 12th district. So we know Ukraine is having success in here. Where or how much, it's really hard to know. A lot of people are reporting that completely Toretsk has come under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces. We know it's not that far, and we know that the Russians don't completely control it. But what we're seeing a lot of, I'm seeing this specific video being shared around of apparently new footage of Azov in Toretsk. Now, I highly doubt that this is new footage due to the leaves on the trees, the lack of snow, and just the overall look. Because people are saying this is today, and then we get other footage which suits the conditions of this. This is what Toretsk looks like today. Okay? Snow on the ground, destruction, all the leaves are off the trees. So realistically, it looks like this. I highly doubt that this is then new footage. I think that is likely being recycled. So of the geolocations and stuff like that, it's hard to confirm where things are actually moving. And we actually want to be correct, not just uphold then a narrative. But to the west of here, we definitely do have some movement. So around Badanivkia, we do have some further geolocations and maps as well. So let's talk about this. So Badanivkia, just around in this area in here, just to the south of here, then above that situation on this front, Ukrainian army captured a serious position south east of Vodiane Druhi. The problem is a lot of this was never actually shown on this map, so it can't show then the blue movements back. And then we'll continue to the west further, and of course we have Pokrovsk, Lysivkia, Shevchenko. Of course, we see the blue popping up on this map. We step back a day, it's still there. Reported on this yesterday. But Shevchenko should have potentially some blue today. So right in here, so just on the outskirts of Shevchenko, right about here, there's multiple geolocations in here, but we do see Russian drones striking Ukrainian vehicles. So maybe blue, potentially grey zone in here, but we know there was definitely movement into these areas as part of then these offensives. But what I'm saying, with the US aid and intelligence being cut, the manpower and command issues, strategically leave optics out of it. The last thing should be then committing forces to offensive actions where likely, highly likely, you will take significantly more losses. Okay, let's move across then to Uspanivkia. We reported on this yesterday, this area coming under control by the Ukrainian armed forces, and then we see Suryak maps then confirming this. We'll move down to then the south of here. We have Andriivkia, Konstantinopol, and we see that the Russians have continued to advance in here, at least according to Suryak maps, that all the way down this road to about where this dogleg is, that they are moving down there. Now, before we move up into Kursk, let's come up into the northeast. We reported on this yesterday to the north of Zapadne, that this forest area had come under control of the Ukrainian forces, and then Suryak maps is confirming then this as well. So we can confirm that the Ukrainian army recaptured a series of positions north of Zapadne. So we can definitely confirm this. A lot of people are saying the reason we're seeing movements down around Pokrovsk is because Russia is focusing more up here and has moved some troops around. But again, we will see. Not showing what Suryak showed here yesterday. Then let's come up into Kursk, and we can see a further reduction in control to the south of Sudzha from here, of moving in to then the north of Guevo as well. We know the Russians definitely want to take back this area just due to the amount of munitions and resources being allocated to here, but we also hear that there is a large amount of Ukrainian reserves currently being deployed into Sumy and then on their way into Kursk as well. So that'll be the end of the mapping. Let's talk about Macron and the Russian and Putin paradox that European leaders, especially Macron, especially little Napoleon, are stuck in. Macron said in a prime-time address to France on Wednesday night that Europe must be prepared to go it alone at defending Ukraine without further assistance from the US under the Trump administration, saying, "I want to believe that the US will stand by our side, but we have to be ready for that not to be the case. Whether we reach peace in Ukraine soon or not, we need to be able to recognise the Russian threat and better defend ourselves in order to deter such attacks. Whatever happens, we need to provide ourselves with more arms, more equipment in terms of defence to provide a dissuasive force." Macron warned that Ukraine cannot be abandoned in its fight against Russia. He said, "Who can believe that in this context Russia will stop at Ukraine? Russia has become and will remain a threat to France. This is the Russian paradox. How can Russia simultaneously be on the brink of defeat or claim strategically already defeated 2 years ago, yet still pose a threat to the rest of Europe? It cannot be both. These are mutually exclusive." He says, "To remain a spectator in this dangerous world would be crazy. We need to continue to help Ukrainians resist until they can negotiate with Russia a solid and lasting peace for themselves and for all of us. The path to peace cannot be achieved by abandoning Ukraine." So again, hearing that of wanting to put Ukraine in a position of power. But we can't just be a spectator. We have to, for as long as it takes and whatever it takes. But what I say is this is rhetoric, Macron. When will France deliver Leclerc tanks? When will they deliver Rafale fighters? When will they deliver other things? Again, what I'm saying is this idea of that our principles stand in the correct position, therefore we will win, we'll talk about that in a second. Zelensky has replied to this and said, I'm grateful to Macron for his clear vision and our joint efforts to achieve peace. Peace must be real, not just a word. It cannot mean Ukraine's capitulation or collapse. It must be just, reliable and lasting. And this can only be achieved through strong and long-term security guarantees for Ukraine, Europe and the entire world. We deeply appreciate the leadership and efforts of those supporting Ukraine and strengthening Europe's defence capabilities. Looking forward to working jointly on the steps towards peace in the upcoming days. So working with these to present something to Trump. Realistically, I think Trump is going to go, yeah, okay, cool. This is my plan. I don't think he's really going to listen to it if it involves more war, which their plans have to at this point in time. And this is where Europe's rhetoric, led by, say, Macron, all falls apart. The Russian paradox, that the Russian army has been then destroyed. But when Russia is a credible threat to NATO. No, the threat to NATO is the pressure that this war has put on those alliances and it not being as strong as many thought. This is also what I call then the Putin paradox, that we're told he's a crazy dictator, a terrorist, who we cannot trust in any way. You ask, well, what about the nuclear weapon threats then? And then we're told, no, that's fine. We can trust that he will not in that aspect of nuclear weapons. Again, it's a paradox. It doesn't then line up. It's not mutually exclusive. Let's go further into this. What France and the EU are failing to understand is that Putin is not the reason these alliances are crumbling. He is merely the pressure that has been applied. And realistically, this actually isn't that much pressure. It is pressure applied not to the alliance of NATO or the EU. It was outside. It's not like a nuke has then landed in Berlin. But the pressure applied, that has shown then these cracks to widen. What I'll say is the more that you lean into the slide, the worse I believe it will become. You've single-handedly allowed an environment where Putin can exploit these cracks and have them evolve into crevasses that they have now become. Putin will take actions that may seem non-tactically sound in order to advance the strategy of dividing NATO. And NATO was the one that gave this opportunity. Firstly, he will ask for Ukrainian elections. He knows that Trump, the US, also wants this. And what this will do is this will drag out negotiations and it will further divide the US and EU. So that will be one of the first things that he will want, is I know that America will side that these elections will take place if there's any negotiation. America wants that too, so I'll push heavily on this. That'll further divide. Again, you've created the environment for this to happen. Next, he will, and he already is, he will show the US and the global south his willingness to negotiate. So he'll say, I'm ready to negotiate, it's them who are not. In turn, this will make it look like the EU is wanting the war to continue at the expense of Ukraine. You have to remember, the West is only a very small part of the world. The West is the exception, not the rule. Due to Europe not wanting to negotiate unless they're in a, quote, position of power, some EU countries and the United States will have reservations around this. This will be vulnerable to Russia's offers to work with them in economic terms, further dividing the alliance. So I spoke about this the other day. So other countries who have reservations about this, say Hungary and Slovakia, they'll be vulnerable for then Putin to go, well, then I will work with you on gas or energy or this or that, doing the exact same thing with America. And again, what I've said is Putin has applied the pressure, but they have allowed the environment to grow where he can actually further then apply this pressure also. Now, there is no way in the world China's leader, Xi Jinping, is not interested in this. There's a real threat also. The US will grow closer to Russia if the EU is not willing to work with the US on where they are moving. Now, you can blame Putin for the war in Ukraine, but Europe should solely blame itself for the division between their own states and the United States. The EU is occupied by truth being subjective, therefore having a weak strategic plan. Artillery does not care about your morals and principles, and I believe that the EU believe that they will be victorious due to themselves thinking that they uphold then the rule of law, their own rights, their own principles. that will then lead them to be victorious. And what I say here is you may well be, but artillery doesn't care about this. And what you need to consider is that Putin and his colleagues, they all believe that they are as right as you do also. That morals, ethics, principles, that doesn't win war. Industrial capacity, manpower, allies, that is what wins attritional war. And currently, Europe has set the stage where their own internal then divides are weakening the alliance massively. And what I say is, it was Putin that applied the pressure, but internally that is allowing that to deteriorate very quickly from pressure from the US, pressure from Putin. Again, go back to what J.D. Vance said. If a few $100,000 then can undermine your democracy, it wasn't that strong to begin with. And this is where I said in that slide, the pressure applied was a bit, but it wasn't massively. The pressure applied was an invasion of a country that sits outside of the EU and outside of NATO. And we have seen as what has become of this now. What happens if that pressure was applied realistically to NATO or to the EU itself? And I think the EU is in real strife, as Putin will play strategy on the table and he may draw more countries somewhat into his orbit as well. I think they need to be very careful of this and maintain the US on their side. Anyway, legends, you have a fantastic day, and hopefully I'll speak to you tomorrow, but realistically I don't think that I will. But you have a fantastic weekend, and I'll see you on birthday on Monday. Thank you. Bye-bye.